You take the blue pill. The story ends. You wake up and believe whatever you want to believe. You take the red pill. You stay in Wonderland. And I show you how deep the rabbit hole goes.
Before Marvel, before the endless wave of superhero universes, before anyone had ever heard the phrase bullet time, there was a green-tinted fever dream from two Chicago-born filmmakers who convinced a nervous studio to bet $60 million on a movie about a computer hacker who might secretly be a messiah. The Matrix didn't just make money when it landed in the summer of 1999. It rewired the vocabulary of action cinema, turned trench coats into a fashion statement, and gave an entire generation a philosophy crash course disguised as a shoot-'em-up. Everyone remembers Neo, the red pill, and the slow-motion bullet dodge. Fewer people know just how strange the road to that iconic dodge actually was. So let's break down 15 facts about the Matrix that even hardcore fans tend to miss. And stick around for the final one, because the truth about that famous freeze-frame shot involves more hardware than most people would ever guess. If you enjoy deep dives into the movies that shaped a generation, go ahead and subscribe before we get started. It genuinely helps more people discover these breakdowns. All right, plug in. Let's go. It's almost impossible to picture anyone else delivering "I know Kung Fu" with a straight face. But Keanu Reeves was a long way down the list when the Wachowskis started shopping the script around Hollywood. Warner Brothers pushed hard for a bigger name first, reportedly wanting Brad Pitt or Val Kilmer to headline. Both passed. Pitt has said he just wrapped a grueling 7 months filming 7 years in Tibet and had no appetite for another demanding production. With those two out, the studio reportedly opened the door to Leonardo DiCaprio, fresh off Titanic, who briefly said yes before deciding he didn't want to follow up one massive effects-driven production with another. Nicolas Cage turned the part down over family commitments. Will Smith, at the time one of the biggest box office draws on the planet coming off Independence Day, and Men in Black, also passed. Smith has since said in interviews that the Wachowskis' pitch, which tried to describe bullet time verbally before there was any footage to show, simply didn't land, and he later admitted he probably wasn't seasoned enough as an actor to have pulled the role off anyway. He took Wild Wild West instead, a film he's openly called one of his career's biggest regrets. The Wachowskis' actual first choice, according to accounts from people close to the production, was Johnny Depp, but the studio wouldn't sign off on him. Somewhere in the shuffle, there was even a moment where producers floated rewriting Neo as a woman for Sandra Bullock, who declined. When Keanu Reeves finally said yes, he committed to months of martial arts training and turned a role that at least 6 other actors had walked away from into one of the defining performances of the decade. Fight choreographer Yuen Wu-Ping, the man behind the wire fu-style scene in classics like Drunken Master, wasn't initially interested in flying to Australia to coach a group of American actors he'd never worked with. So he set conditions he assumed would end the conversation quickly: a significant fee, and a demand that the entire principal cast train in martial arts for months before a single frame was shot. Warner Brothers agreed without hesitation. That meant Keanu Reeves, Carrie-Anne Moss, and Laurence Fishburne were reporting for full days of stretching, wire work, and choreography drills long before cameras rolled. Training so intense that Reeves later described being physically wrecked by the end of most sessions. This wasn't a few afternoons of light stunt prep. It was closer to a full-time job that ran for months, with the cast building strength, flexibility, and enough fundamental technique that Yuen Wu-Ping's team could start layering in actual choreography rather than faking it in close-up. Reeves also came into the project recovering from a spinal surgery that had caused partial leg paralysis, and he trained for weeks in a neck brace, which is part of the reason Neo's fighting style in the first film leans more heavily on punches than kicks, a workaround born out of necessity that ended up shaping how audiences remember the character's fighting style. Moss, meanwhile, sprained her ankle during the rooftop chase sequence and reportedly kept it quiet rather than risk being pulled from the production, wrapping it herself and continuing through the rest of her stunt work. Fishburne, for his part, brought a background in stage combat and physical performance from years of prior film and theater work, which reportedly made him a faster study during the choreography sessions than either of his younger co-stars. Whatever the exact motivations behind each actor's endurance, the payoff is on screen. None of the leads look like actors faking martial arts in wide shots that quickly cut away. They look like people who spent months actually learning it, because, by every account of the production, they had. Carrie-Anne Moss owns the opening chase sequence so completely that it's hard to imagine the role belonging to anyone else. But the path to casting Trinity went through several other major names first. Jada Pinkett Smith made it deep into the process, and reportedly did a screen test opposite Keanu Reeves, but the chemistry between the two didn't convince the filmmakers. The Wachowskis liked her enough to bring her into the franchise later anyway, writing the character Niobe specifically for her in the sequels, a rare case of a near-miss casting decision turning into its own payoff 2 movies later. Janet Jackson was also considered for Trinity around the same period, but a conflicting concert tour schedule made the timing impossible. Jackson has spoken publicly about how difficult it was to pass on the project, and she later referenced The Matrix in interludes on her 2008 album Discipline. Sandra Bullock, who had earlier been mentioned in connection with a reworked version of Neo, was also approached for Trinity and turned it down. Rosie Perez and Salma Hayek reportedly auditioned as well. In the end, a relatively unknown Canadian actress walked into the room, and the search was over. Warner Brothers didn't hand the Wachowskis a blank check to make The Matrix. According to reporting on the production, the studio approved an initial budget in the range of $10 million, enough to shoot a proof of concept, with a clear understanding that the rest of the funding depended on what that footage looked like. The Wachowskis poured almost the entire amount into the opening sequence, Trinity's hotel fight, the rooftop chase, agents closing in as she runs out of options. Everything that made bullet time function as a usable filmmaking tool rather than a theoretical pitch had to come together in those minutes. Custom camera rigs, extensive stunt training, and visual effects nobody had attempted at that scale before. When Warner Brothers executives watched the finished sequence, the response was immediate, and the studio committed to the full budget, which ultimately landed around $60 to $63 million. An entire film's future rode on 10 minutes of test footage, and it worked well enough that the rest of the conversation was practically a formality. The digital rain cascading down screens throughout the film is one of the most recognizable visual signatures in modern cinema, and for years, fans assumed it represented some kind of dense, meaningful programming language hiding in plain sight. Production designer Simon Whiteley, who created the effect while working at the Sydney studio Animalogic, has explained in multiple interviews that his inspiration came from something much closer to home, his wife's Japanese cookbooks. Struggling to land on a design that felt technical but organic, Whiteley began scanning characters, primarily katakana, one of Japan's syllabic scripts, because he liked how clean and geometric the individual strokes looked on screen. He mixed in Western numerals and other symbols, then flipped and stylized the characters until they no longer resembled readable text at all. It's worth being precise about what this does and doesn't mean. Whiteley has said he enjoys describing the code as made from sushi recipes, and some of his source material genuinely came from cookbook pages, but he's also clarified that the final on-screen code isn't a literal, readable recipe. The characters were altered too heavily for that, and traditional sushi instructions are typically written in hiragana and kanji rather than the stylized katakana he leaned on. He's also kept the exact cookbook a secret all these years, calling it the last bit of magic of the design. Either way, one of the most analyzed visual symbols in science fiction history traces back, at least in part, to a stack of recipe pages sitting in a production designer's kitchen. Watch The Matrix closely enough, and you'll notice something that most first-time viewers absorb without ever consciously naming it. Every scene inside the simulation carries a faint green cast, while every scene in the real world runs cold and blue. This wasn't a filter slapped on in post-production. The production reportedly built the color scheme directly into the physical sets. Lighting was gelled, fabrics were dyed, and paint choices were made with the palette already in mind before cameras ever entered the rooms. The green tone inside the Matrix nods to old monochrome computer displays, reinforcing the idea that the world Neo has been living in is essentially a screen he's trapped behind without realizing it. The blue tone aboard the Nebuchadnezzar and in the machine-ravaged future outside the simulation feels harsher and more sterile, less comfortable, but more honest. The effect is subtle enough that most audiences never consciously clock it on a first viewing, which is exactly the point. A viewer doesn't need to notice the color shift to feel it. The brain registers something is different about this scene, well before the plot explains why. It's a quiet visual system running underneath the story, answering the question of which reality are we in right now, before a single line of dialogue does. And it's one of the clearest examples in the film of the Wachowskis treating the camera and the set itself as storytelling tools, not just a way to record actors saying lines. In Greek mythology, Morpheus is the god of dreams, a figure who slips into the minds of sleeping humans and constructs the visions they experience while unconscious. The name comes from the Greek word for form or shape, a nod to Morpheus's supposed ability to take on any appearance inside a dream. Laurence Fishburne's character does the exact opposite. Rather than building illusions for people to sleep through, this Morpheus spends the entire film dragging people out of a constructed illusion and forcing them to confront something real, often for the first time in their lives. It's a deliberate inversion. The mythological Morpheus builds the dream, and the film's Morpheus tears it down. The layered reference doesn't stop there. His ship, the Nebuchadnezzar, is named after the ancient Babylonian king known in religious and historical texts for vivid, prophetic dreams he couldn't interpret without outside help. Morpheus, in other words, pilots a vessel named after a man who needed someone else to explain the meaning of his own visions to him. A small but pointed piece of the mythology and philosophy scaffolding the Wachowskis, built into nearly every name in the film. The martial arts training wasn't the only preparation the Wachowskis put their leads through. Before filming began, the principal cast reportedly received a reading list intended to make sure they understood the ideas the movie was actually built around, not just the choreography. At the top of that list was Simulacra and Simulation by French philosopher Jean Baudrillard, a dense text arguing that modern society gradually replaces genuine reality with symbols and representations until the line between the real and the artificial collapses entirely. The book appears as a physical prop within the film itself. Neo hides illegal software inside a hollowed-out copy of it. Reports on the production also mention Out of Control by Kevin Kelly, which explores how technology can behave like a living, evolving system, and material on evolutionary psychology, covering how the human brain constructs its sense of reality. The goal, as the Wachowskis reportedly framed it, wasn't to make actors who could recite red-pill dialogue convincingly. It was to make sure the people saying those lines actually understood the argument underneath them. The Matrix is never explicit about which American city it takes place in, but the production never set foot in the United States at all. The entire shoot relocated to Sydney, Australia, filming primarily at Fox Studios and on the surrounding city streets, a decision that reportedly saved Warner Brothers somewhere in the range of $30 million, a meaningful cushion for a studio still nervous about funding an expensive film built around simulated reality and downloaded martial arts. The Wachowskis, both raised in the Chicago area, weren't willing to let the setting go entirely abstract, though. Street signs referencing real Chicago names like Wabash, Lake, Franklin, and Erie appear throughout the film, and the general geography of the story maps loosely onto the loop. Crews worked to keep unmistakably Australian landmarks out of frame. No opera house, no harbor bridge, so nothing would break the illusion of an anonymous American city. Sharp-eyed viewers have still spotted the occasional giveaway, like cars parked in patterns that don't quite match American traffic conventions. A city built inside a simulation, mapped after Chicago, and filmed on the other side of the planet, appropriately. A few layers removed from where it claims to be. Describing simulated realities in frozen time camera work to a room full of studio executives in 1997 was, by most accounts, going nowhere. So the Wachowskis tried a different approach. They hired comic book artist Jeff Darrow and Steve Skroce to draw the entire film, shot by shot, fight by fight, as a nearly 600-page storyboard. The presentation reportedly had one Wachowski narrating the story while the other provided sound effects, walking a room full of studio suits through a stack of drawings the size of a phone book. It worked. The scale of the project, a script by two directors with only one previous, low-budget feature to their name, asking for tens of millions of dollars to attempt visual effects that had never been done before, was the kind of pitch that needed to be seen rather than described. According to people involved in the production, a striking number of those storyboard panels ended up matching the finished film almost shot for shot, which suggests the Wachowskis weren't hoping executives would trust a vague vision. They arrived with the vision already fully built. The dojo training sequence marks the moment Neo stops looking like a confused office worker and starts looking like someone who might actually survive the rest of the film. Partway through the scene, after Morpheus has thrown him around the room a few times, Neo settles into his stance and wipes his nose with his thumb, a small, quick gesture that most viewers miss entirely on a first watch. That detail wasn't in the script. Reeves has said he added it himself as a deliberate nod to Bruce Lee, who used the same gesture repeatedly throughout his own films, most famously in Enter the Dragon, as a small physical cue that a fight was about to shift into a different gear. By the point the scene was filmed, Reeves had absorbed enough real martial arts training to recognize the reference and understand exactly what it signaled. Given that Neo has just had an entire library of fighting styles downloaded directly into his brain, the idea that some of Bruce Lee's specific mannerisms came along with the package fits neatly within the film's own internal logic. A throwaway gesture that's actually doing narrative work if you know what you're looking at. Black leather look coats, razor-thin sunglasses, everything gleaming like the future had a strict dress code. The Matrix helped invent an aesthetic that fashion designers, cosplayers, and Halloween costume shops are still borrowing more than 2 decades later. Costume designer Kim Barrett pulled most of it off without an especially lavish budget. Trinity's catsuit, worn through virtually every action sequence in the film, wasn't leather at all. It was PVC vinyl, chosen specifically because it caught light with the same glossy, almost liquid sheen Barrett wanted, at a fraction of the cost of real leather. Neo's coat was a lightweight wool blend, selected largely because it moved dramatically during wire work and flared well in motion, not because it was the most expensive option available. The one place the production didn't cut corners was the sunglasses. Each pair was custom fitted to the individual actor's face, so they'd stay in place during stunts without sliding or breaking on camera. Everything else about the look that launched 1,000 cosplay conventions was, by design, sourced as cheaply as it could be while still photographing like the future. The image of Neo floating in a slimy human battery pod, freshly disconnected from a lifetime of illusion, is one of the film's most unsettling visuals. Getting it on camera reportedly caused a real medical problem behind the scenes. The liquid used in early tests combined water with a thickening gel to achieve the viscous, biological texture the filmmakers wanted, and it looked exactly right through the camera. On an actual human body, though, that mixture pulled heat away from the skin extremely fast enough that a stunt performer developed hypothermia symptoms in a matter of minutes during testing. The production adjusted the formula before Reeves ever got in the pod himself, warming the liquid and switching to a corn syrup-based gel that photographed the same way, without the same risk. Reeves also spent weeks preparing physically for the sequence, reportedly losing weight and altering his appearance so Neo would read on screen as someone who genuinely never used his muscles or seen daylight. A level of commitment to a scene that, once filmed, ultimately relied on a modified waterslide rig to send him tumbling into the tank below. The frozen in midair shot of Neo bending backward while the camera appears to sweep around him became the single most imitated visual effect of the early 2000s, and pulling it off required a setup that hadn't really been attempted at that scale before. The technique, commonly called bullet time, used a ring of dozens of still cameras arranged around the action, each positioned at a slightly different angle and aimed at the same subject. The cameras fired in rapid succession, capturing a sequence of still images of the same frozen moment from incrementally shifting positions around the circle. Those individual frames were then assembled digitally into a single continuous shot, creating the illusion of a camera flying freely through a moment where time itself had stopped. Building the rig alone was its own engineering problem. Every camera had to be precisely calibrated and triggered in the right sequence, and the visual effects team then had to blend the resulting still images into something that read as smooth, continuous motion rather than a slideshow, a process that required custom software built specifically for the production, since nothing off the shelf could handle it at the time. To perform inside that ring, Reeves worked on wire rigs, holding him in positions no human body sustains naturally on its own, which is a large part of why the shot looks effortless despite the amount of rigging required to produce it. The effect worked so completely that action films for years afterward tried to replicate it, and most of them ended up demonstrating that the technique required a lot more engineering and a lot more patience than simply surrounding an actor with cameras and hoping for the best. 2.5 decades later, the shot is still the reference point every filmmaker reaches for when they want an audience to understand, instantly, what frozen in time is supposed to look like. Here's the fact that tends to surprise even longtime fans. When The Matrix went into production, Warner Brothers wasn't signing off on a franchise. The deal on the table was for a single film, full stop. The studio's $10 million test investment and later expanded budget were both built around getting one movie to work, not laying the foundation for 2 sequels shot back-to-back years later. It was the film's unexpected performance, both critically and at the box office, eventually crossing well past $460 million worldwide against that roughly $60 million budget. That opened the door to The Matrix Reloaded and The Matrix Revolutions, both filmed simultaneously several years afterward. Brad Pitt has specifically pointed to this as part of why the trilogy framing never affected his decision to pass on the role in the first place. As far as he understood it at the time, there wasn't a trilogy